Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. The sky was gray, almost matching the black veil covering my face. Each step toward the cemetery felt heavier than the last, like I was dragging not just my body, but a lifetime of memories. I had loved that woman deeply, not just as my husband's mother, but as my own. She had held me when I miscarried, defended me during family fights, and whispered encouragement when I doubted myself. Her death felt like a pillar beneath me had crumbled. I had no idea she had left behind more than sorrow. That day, I believed I had lost the last person who truly saw me. I had no idea what her final act of love would reveal. As the priest spoke his final words, I stood near the grave holding a single white rose. My husband stood beside me, stiff and cold, barely glancing in my direction. I thought it was grief. I excused the distance, the silence, the way his eyes didn't meet mine anymore. I told myself he was in pain too. But deep inside, something felt off. The way he avoided touching me, how quickly he left the reception afterward. I chalked it up to mourning. But I should have known. Behind that silence, betrayal was already breathing down my neck. Back at home, the house felt empty without her voice echoing through the hallway. I sat in her old chair, wrapping myself in her scent, still fresh on the cushion. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. I just cried, silently, endlessly, mourning not only her death, but the sudden coldness that had taken over my marriage. That night, I lit a candle beside her photo and prayed. Not for peace, but for answers. I didn't know it yet, but in just a few days, I would get them, in the most brutal and unexpected way imaginable. She wasn't just my mother-in-law. She was my confidant, my protector, the one person who truly saw me. When my own mother turned her back on me for marrying young, it was my mother-in-law who welcomed me with warm arms and a full heart. She taught me how to cook her son's favorite meals, how to handle his mood swings, and how to hold my head high when the world looked down on me. Her voice had a softness that could calm any storm. And in her final weeks, that voice grew frail, but never stopped caring. Her last words to me were whispered with trembling lips, "I see you. And I'm proud of you." After she passed, I kept replaying those words in my mind, clinging to them like a lifeline. I didn't know what she meant. Proud of me for what? I hadn't accomplished anything special. I had endured, survived, stayed quiet through betrayals I suspected but never dared to confirm. I thought she didn't know. But maybe she did. Maybe those words were her way of telling me she had seen it all, and had made peace with what was to come. I just didn't understand their weight until the day I stepped into that lawyer's office. The grief ate me alive. I cried when I saw her favorite teacup, untouched in the cabinet. I broke down when I found her shawl draped over the couch, just as she had left it. Nothing in the house felt the same. Not even my husband. He wasn't mourning. He was distant, distracted, glued to his phone and always finding reasons to be away. I told myself everyone grieves differently. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know that the truth would explode in my face, and that her death would be the beginning of my own rebirth. The invitation came in a plain white envelope, stamped with the name of the firm that had handled all my mother-in-law's affairs. I opened it with shaking hands, feeling a mix of sadness and obligation. A part of me didn't want to go. I wasn't ready to hear her name spoken in the past tense, wasn't ready to hear finalities. But something inside me told me to be strong, maybe out of respect, maybe because she would have wanted me there. I dressed in black again, tied my hair back, and stepped into a taxi with a knot in my throat. I had no idea that within minutes, I'd be facing a truth far more devastating than death. The waiting room was cold, with white walls and sterile silence. I sat in the corner, clutching my purse like it was a shield. I thought I would be alone, just me, the lawyer, maybe some paperwork. But then the door opened, and I heard familiar footsteps. My husband walked in without a word, not even a glance. And behind him, a woman followed, holding something small and wrapped in a pale blue blanket. I blinked. My body froze. It wasn't until the woman looked at me with smug defiance that I saw what she carried. A baby. A real, breathing, cooing baby. My heart dropped to the floor. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I looked at my husband again, desperate for an explanation, for denial, for shame, anything. But there was nothing. His eyes avoided mine completely. The woman took the seat beside him like she belonged there. I sat alone, across from them, completely invisible. And in that moment, I realized, this wasn't just a legal appointment. This was a performance, and I was the only one who didn't know the script. At first, I thought she was the assistant or maybe a secretary from the firm. She looked too polished, too comfortable. But then, she leaned in toward my husband, whispering something with a soft laugh, and placed her hand delicately over his. That's when the blood drained from my face. I recognized that kind of touch. It wasn't friendly or casual. It was intimate. My husband didn't pull away. He didn't even flinch. He let her rest her hand on his like it belonged there. I stared at them, paralyzed, my mind refusing to believe what my eyes were already screaming. Her arms were wrapped protectively around a newborn, maybe just a few weeks old. My stomach twisted into knots. I tried to find a reason, maybe it was a cousin, a friend's child, something innocent. But when the baby shifted and I saw the shape of his eyes, I knew. They were identical to my husband's. That same deep almond shape, that same tiny scar under the brow. My hands began to tremble. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. My entire body went cold with betrayal. She looked at me. Not with guilt. Not even with discomfort. She smiled, that slow, confident smile of someone who thinks they've won. My husband didn't even turn to me. He kept his gaze forward, his expression blank. I was invisible to them. Just a shadow in the corner of the room, clinging to the ruins of a life that was already gone. I had come to honor a woman I loved like a mother. Instead, I had walked straight into a scene from my worst nightmare. And there was no waking up from this one, because this pain was real. And it was just getting started. It felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. My knees gave out, and I grabbed the edge of the chair to keep from collapsing. I kept staring at the baby, silently begging for a sign that I was wrong. But the resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same expression, even the same dimple on the left cheek. My heart began racing, pounding so loudly I could barely hear the room around me. My mouth went dry. I turned to my husband, praying for some reaction. But he wouldn't even meet my gaze. That silence hurt more than any slap. Not even a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Just coldness. Just distance. It was as if I had become a ghost to him, someone he once knew but had already buried in his mind. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to drag the truth out of him. But my throat refused to open. The betrayal was too loud, too sharp, and too real. I could feel every heartbeat like a wound. And still, neither of them spoke a word to me. I sat there, frozen, surrounded by legal folders and the weight of betrayal pressing against my chest. The lawyer entered, greeting everyone with a professional nod, oblivious to the storm that had already erupted in my soul. I couldn't even look at the woman anymore. Her smile, the baby, the way she leaned on my husband, it was all too much. This wasn't how I imagined grief. I had come expecting sadness. But what I found was humiliation. And the worst part was, the pain had only just begun. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and I saw it, not surprise, not shock, but pity. A deep, quiet pity that burned worse than judgment. He knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to recognize the betrayal unfolding before him. My cheeks were flushed, my throat tight, and my fingers clenched into the fabric of my dress. I considered leaving, standing up and walking out before another wound opened. But something made me stay. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was that tiny ember of hope that my mother-in-law had left me something more than pain. He cleared his throat and opened a thick leather folder. His voice was formal, steady, but I could hear the hesitation when he reached the name of the beneficiary. I looked around the room, at the woman cradling the baby, at the man I had once called my husband, and I braced myself. What could possibly be left for me in this nightmare? A token gift? A small gesture of sympathy? I expected nothing. My heart had already accepted that I was invisible in their world now. But I stayed, because some part of me still needed to hear her voice, even through someone else's mouth. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sound of the baby's soft cooing. It felt like a cruel reminder that this child, a symbol of my husband's betrayal, now occupied the space that once belonged to the family I thought I had. The lawyer paused again, glanced toward me, and began to read aloud. I took a deep breath. Whatever was coming next, I had no armor left. Only raw skin, an open heart, and the memory of the woman who had once called me her daughter. I didn't know it yet, but what she had left me was more powerful than anyone in that room could imagine. The room went still the moment those words left the lawyer's mouth. My eyes widened, and my hands gripped the edge of the chair so tightly I thought the wood would crack. To my beloved daughter-in-law, not a mention of my name yet, but I knew. She meant me. The woman he was about to describe, that was me. My chest rose and fell rapidly. I wasn't prepared for kindness. I wasn't prepared for love. Especially not here, in a room so thick with betrayal. The lawyer continued reading, and each word felt like a lifeline pulling me from the darkness. Who cared for me like a true daughter, who never turned her back on me, even in my weakest days? I could barely hold my tears back. In that moment, I saw her face again, pale and frail in her final days, but still full of dignity. She had seen me. Through all the silence, the tears I cried alone, the nights I slept beside a man already gone, she had seen me. That acknowledgement felt like justice. Like the first drop of rain after a year-long drought. Across from me, I saw the color drain from my husband's face. The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably in her chair, gripping the baby a little tighter. But I didn't look at them for long. For the first time in weeks, I didn't care what they thought. I listened. I absorbed every word my mother-in-law had left behind. Her voice, even if filtered through a stranger, felt closer than ever. And I knew, deep down, something was coming. Something none of them expected. And this was only the beginning. The lawyer's voice didn't tremble. His tone remained calm, professional, but the words he read sent shockwaves through the room. The entirety of my estate, including property, financial accounts, and personal assets, shall be transferred to my daughter-in-law, and to no one else. I stopped breathing. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. But he repeated it. There was no mistake. Everything. Every last cent. Not a single mention of her son. Not a word about the baby in the other woman's arms. I turned slowly toward my husband. His face was frozen, pale as ash, lips pressed into a thin, furious line. He opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but the lawyer raised a hand and continued. The woman next to him fidgeted, clearly agitated, bouncing the baby to soothe him. But the tension in the room was too thick, even the child could feel it. My heart pounded, not from greed or satisfaction, but from the overwhelming weight of justice. This wasn't about money. It was about recognition. About truth. And my mother-in-law had made sure I would not be erased. I had spent years pouring my soul into a family that barely noticed. Years in silence, swallowing pain, enduring cold glances, empty nights, and growing distance. And now, with just one decision, one signature sealed by death, she had spoken louder than anyone ever had. This wasn't revenge. It was protection. She knew what I was about to face. She knew the moment she closed her eyes for the last time, I'd be surrounded by wolves. So she left me more than just an inheritance. She left me power. And for the first time, I wasn't powerless anymore. No one said a word. The air was thick with shock, humiliation, and barely controlled rage. My husband's hands curled into fists on his lap, his knuckles white. His face flushed red with fury, then drained of all color as reality sank in. The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably, her smile long gone. She held the baby closer, but even the child sensed the change. He stopped moving, as if the tension had frozen him too. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just sat there and let the silence speak for itself. My husband finally looked at me, but there was no love, no apology in his eyes, only resentment. As if I had betrayed him by being chosen. As if I had stolen something that belonged to him. The irony made my stomach turn. He had taken everything from me emotionally, piece by piece, over the years. And now, when justice was served, he looked at me like I was the thief. The audacity of his pain was almost laughable. But I didn't laugh. I stayed silent, letting the weight of my mother-in-law's words echo in his ears instead of mine. The lawyer cleared his throat, ready to continue, but paused to give the room a moment. I could feel all eyes on me, even if no one dared speak aloud. I knew the storm wasn't over, it was just beginning. This wasn't going to end in that office. There would be fallout, retaliation, consequences. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had something they didn't, the truth, the law, and a mother's final act of love carved in ink. And I would hold on to that with every ounce of strength I had left. His voice remained calm, but every word hit like thunder. 2 months before her death, he said, your mother-in-law revised the will after learning of a breach of trust within the family. I felt my breath catch again. A breach of trust. He didn't say the word affair, but we all knew what he meant. She had known. Somehow, in her final days, she had discovered the truth, the lies, the betrayal, the child born in secrecy. And rather than confront it in anger, she had acted in silence. With a pen, with a signature, she delivered her judgment. She made it very clear, the lawyer continued, that her son was not to receive a single cent. Not now. Not ever. I glanced at my husband, whose expression now twisted with something worse than rage. It was humiliation. He had counted on the money. He had counted on the house. Maybe even hoped to raise that baby inside the very walls I had once called home. And now? He had nothing. All because the woman he had cast aside had become the only one trusted to carry on his mother's legacy. The room grew colder, heavier. And I stayed still, refusing to break. I remembered the last time I saw my mother-in-law awake. Her eyes tired, her voice weak, but still strong enough to say, take care of yourself. They don't deserve you. I hadn't understood it then, but now it all made sense. She had known what I couldn't face. She had watched her son turn into a stranger and had chosen to protect me, even from beyond the grave. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And now, here I was, holding not just the weight of her will, but the shield she had left behind, to survive everything she knew was coming. I remembered those evenings now with a clarity that cut through the noise. She would call me into her room, ask me to sit beside her, and hold my hand for long minutes in silence. Sometimes she'd cry without saying why. I thought it was the illness. I thought she was afraid of dying. But now I realized, she wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for me. For the pain she knew I was carrying, even when I pretended to be fine. She had seen behind my smile, behind my quietness, and she had understood everything. There were moments when I saw her distance herself from her son. She stopped asking about his work. She no longer smiled when he entered the room. She avoided long conversations with him, often pretending to be asleep. At the time, I thought they had simply drifted apart, as people sometimes do during illness. But now I could see it for what it really was: disappointment. She had discovered what he had done and couldn't bear to look at him the same way again. And instead of lashing out, she had chosen a quiet punishment: exclusion. She had turned to me for comfort. Me, the woman her son betrayed. She held my hand like I was the only one still worthy of her time. And in those silent gestures, she was building something I didn't see until now: trust. Legacy. A bond that no betrayal could erase. She was preparing me, without words, to carry what she would leave behind. And now that truth came crashing over me, too big to hold inside. She had never stopped loving me. Even as her own son turned his back on me, she never did. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he jumped up, his voice suddenly erupting through the silent room. "This isn't right." She was sick. She didn't know what she was doing, he shouted, pointing at me with trembling hands. The calm mask he had worn all day cracked wide open, revealing the fury and panic beneath. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him, seeing clearly now the man I had once loved, full of pride, full of entitlement, and now cornered. "You tricked her," he screamed. "You turned her against me while she was dying." But no one moved. No one believed him. The lawyer, with quiet authority, gestured for him to sit down. "Mr. Vega, there is a notarized video testimony. Your mother was of sound mind and acted with full legal capacity." My husband's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked around, hoping for support, but even the mistress avoided his eyes. I saw the desperation bubbling behind his glare, not from grief, but from loss, of control, of money, of power. For so long, he had held the reins. Now they were gone. Taken not by force, but by the will of the one woman he never thought would turn against him. I kept my gaze steady, refusing to be shaken. I had stayed silent for so long, biting my tongue, swallowing betrayal. But now I had nothing to hide. I didn't have to scream. The truth was already out, carved into a document sealed by death itself. His shouting couldn't erase it. His tantrum couldn't undo it. And no matter how many lies he tried to throw at me now, the world, and the law, were finally seeing him for who he really was. And I was finally being seen too. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and retrieved a small black device. He placed it on the table and pressed play. The screen lit up, and there she was, pale, weak, but unmistakably lucid. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were clear. "If you're watching this," she began, "it means I'm gone, and my son is still denying what he did." I felt the breath leave my lungs. Even from the grave, she was defending the truth. Every word she spoke sliced through the tension in the room like a knife. "I changed my will because I saw with my own eyes what he became," she said. "Not because I was manipulated, but because I was betrayed." My husband shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, eyes darting toward the floor. She continued, speaking of her love for me, how I had cared for her when no one else did. "She stayed." "He didn't," she said firmly. She held my hand. "He held lies." Tears welled up in my eyes. The pain I had buried for so long was now being spoken aloud, not by me, but by someone whose voice could no longer be silenced. The room fell into a hush so deep I could hear the baby breathing in the mistress's arms. My husband sat frozen, unable to defend himself against the voice of the woman who had given him life, and taken his legacy away with a single declaration. "I trust her," she said in that final moment, "and I want the world to know it." The screen went black. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting those words wash over me. That video wasn't just a will. It was her final blessing. Her last gift. And in that moment, I felt stronger than I had in years. Her voice echoed through the room, low but sharp, each word carrying more weight than any accusation could. He betrayed her not once, but over and over. And she stayed silent. But I won't. Those words hit him like bullets. My husband lowered his head, unable to look at anyone. The mistress shifted nervously in her seat, her lips tight, arms tightening around the baby. And me? I sat perfectly still, watching justice unfold in a way no courtroom ever could. It wasn't anger I felt, it was vindication, pure and quiet. My will is not about punishment, she continued. It's about truth. It's about making sure the one who gave love receives it in return. I could barely hold back the tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of finally being seen. For so long, I had questioned my worth, asked myself what I had done wrong. But now, in front of those who tried to erase me, I was being honored, not with money, but with truth. My mother-in-law had seen everything I hid. And with those words, she restored everything I had lost. The video ended on her final sentence, "If justice exists, let it begin with my will." The screen went black, and the silence that followed was deafening. The lawyer looked up, folding his hands carefully over the folder as if sealing the truth with reverence. No one dared to speak. The room wasn't just still, it was shattered. Because that wasn't just a recording. It was a weapon. A farewell. And a legacy. And now, it belonged to me. Not out of luck, but out of everything I had survived. She stood abruptly, clutching the baby as if that would shield her from the shame that filled the room. Her heels clicked against the floor as she moved toward the door, but before she could reach it, the baby let out a sharp, piercing cry. It wasn't a hungry cry or a sleepy one, it sounded like confusion, like the world around him had just cracked open. Everyone turned toward the sound, frozen. She froze too. Her shoulders tensed. Her eyes flicked toward me, but I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched it all unfold. She rocked him, whispered his name under her breath, but nothing soothed him. He cried louder. As if even his tiny body could sense that everything his mother and father had tried to build was falling apart. The lawyer waited in silence. My husband stared at the floor, hands limp in his lap, saying nothing. It was a strange kind of justice, poetic in its timing, the cries of the child silencing the adults who had caused so much harm. She looked to my husband for help, but he didn't offer it. The space between them suddenly felt like a wall. I should have felt pity. I should have felt something. But I didn't. Not anymore. I had cried enough for everyone in that room. I had bled in silence for years while they planned a life behind my back. Now the crying wasn't mine to do. That baby, innocent, unchosen, was the only one I felt sorry for. Because he would grow up in the shadow of this day, whether they admitted it or not. And while they stood there trying to figure out what to do next, I sat quietly, knowing that the worst for me was finally over, and the worst for them had just begun. As soon as I stepped outside, the sunlight hit my face like a slap. I had expected to feel relief, but all I felt was emptiness. My legs barely carried me down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. I clutched my purse against my chest like it could somehow hold my heart together. The ring on my finger burned, not physically, but with memory. The promises it symbolized were now ashes. I had worn it through every betrayal, every lonely night, every lie. And I still hadn't found the strength to take it off. My thoughts were a whirlwind. I was now the legal owner of everything he thought he'd inherit, yet I felt no triumph. What is victory when you've lost the man you once loved, and discovered he never truly loved you back? I kept seeing her face, that smug smile, the baby's cry, the look of panic in his eyes. And then, the voice of my mother-in-law, clear and unwavering, giving me back the power I didn't even know I needed. But even with the truth exposed and the will signed, my soul still carried the bruises of 1,000 silent battles. That pain doesn't vanish in a single afternoon. When I reached the sidewalk, I stood there without moving, watching cars pass and people live lives untouched by my storm. The world kept spinning. No one knew what had just happened. No one saw the war I had just walked through. I was a woman grieving a death, not just of a person, but of an illusion. The marriage I had protected for years had died long before that day, and I was the only one who didn't notice. I took a deep breath, finally feeling the weight of that realization. And in that moment, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. He filed appeals, hired expensive lawyers, and fed them lies in hopes of rewriting a truth that had already been sealed. But no matter what he said, that video stood like a wall he couldn't break. It was her voice, her face, her words, undeniable and clear. Every time they played it in court, the judge leaned forward, eyebrows drawn in sympathy and certainty. He tried to say she had been manipulated, that she was confused, that I had pressured her. But none of it stuck. The law didn't care about his bitterness. It cared about evidence. And I had it. He came to one of the hearings with the mistress by his side, dressed in black like a widow. The irony was almost unbearable. She held the baby like a prop, her eyes scanning the room for sympathy that never arrived. The courtroom was cold, clinical, and exact, and for once, I wasn't the one who had to prove anything. I sat quietly, my head held high, letting the truth do the work. His words grew weaker with every session. His desperation more obvious. The inheritance wasn't slipping away, it had already left his hands the day he chose betrayal over loyalty. After weeks of resistance, the court issued its final ruling, the will stood as written. No appeals. No changes. Everything now belonged to me. I walked out of that courthouse not with arrogance, but with closure. He looked at me one last time before disappearing down the hall, but I didn't return the glance. I didn't need to. That chapter had ended not with a fight, but with a signature. And while he had spent his days trying to undo the past, I was ready, finally, to start building my future. I returned to the house a week after the court ruling, key in hand, heart heavy but firm. It was strange stepping into a place that had once felt warm, now filled with ghosts of dinners, arguments, and broken trust. Every corner whispered memories, both sweet and sour. I wandered through the hallway, touching the walls like I was saying hello to a stranger. The air smelled like her, lavender and lemon, as if my mother-in-law had left a piece of her behind just for me. This house no longer belonged to a liar or a thief. It belonged to the one who had stayed loyal until the very end. Bank accounts, titles, deeds, all transferred into my name with swift, cold efficiency. The process was clinical, almost surreal. I watched emails come in confirming amounts I had never imagined holding. Yet no number could patch the wound in my chest. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply watched as the life he thought he'd owned slipped into my hands, not because I asked, but because I was chosen. Chosen by the woman he'd failed, by the justice he never expected. The weight of ownership was real. And it was heavier than gold. I stood in the backyard, staring at the land she once loved, and whispered, "Thank you. Not for the wealth, but for the courage. For seeing me. For giving me the strength to walk away with dignity and not revenge." Everything I had now came at a price, years of silence, of endurance, of betrayal buried deep under routine. But I was done being the quiet wife in the background. Now I was the woman who inherited everything, not through luck, but through truth. And no one could take that away from me. At first, the silence was deafening. Friends I had shared holidays with, people who once hugged me at birthday dinners, gone. No calls. No messages. Just silence. Then the whispers started, slipping through mutual contacts like poison in the wind. She manipulated the will. She took advantage while the poor woman was dying. I had expected betrayal from him, but not from everyone else. It was as if loyalty had an expiration date, and it ended the moment I no longer fit their narrative. His family was even crueler. His sister, who I once held while she cried over a breakup, called me heartless on social media. His aunt sent me a letter filled with venom, accusing me of tearing the family apart. No one asked for the truth. No one wanted to hear that I had spent years in silence while they turned a blind eye to his lies. To them, I was the villain because I didn't crumble. Because I walked out of the courtroom with the papers they thought belonged to someone else. I wasn't the abandoned wife. I was the inconvenient reminder that sometimes justice looks like vengeance, even when it's not. It hurt, yes, but not in the way it used to. I no longer begged to be understood. I didn't explain myself, didn't argue, didn't try to convince anyone of what really happened. Let them believe what they want. Let them rewrite history in their own heads. I knew what I lived. I knew what I endured. I carried the scars they never saw. And now, I walked with my head high, not because I had won, but because I had survived. And no one's silence or hate could undo that. It was late. I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house aimlessly, drawn to her old bedroom like a ghost seeking something unfinished. I opened the bottom drawer of her nightstand, not expecting anything except the scent of old perfume and folded scarves. But then I saw it, a cream-colored envelope, thick and sealed, with my name written in her shaky handwriting. My heart skipped. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands trembling as I opened it. The paper crackled softly, and as my eyes moved across the first line, tears began to form. She wrote with clarity, even as death hovered near her shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," she began. But I needed to be sure that I wasn't just angry, but right. Her words were full of sorrow, but also strength. She told me she had hired someone, a private investigator, when she first suspected her son's betrayal. She wrote about how she watched her world crumble as the evidence confirmed everything. Photos. Hotel receipts. Texts. The baby's due date. I wanted to scream, she confessed. But I had no strength left to waste on shouting. Instead, she poured all her energy into protecting me. "You were the only light left in this family," she wrote. "And I couldn't let you walk away with nothing but pain." She explained how she met with her lawyer quietly, changed the will, and left behind every legal defense she could to shield me. "I knew they would come for you," she warned, "but I made sure they would never win." I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing quietly in the dark. She hadn't just left me an inheritance. She had left me armor. And now I understood, her silence had been her strategy, and her love, louder than any word spoken aloud. She didn't write with bitterness, she wrote with heartbreak. Every word in that letter revealed how deeply she had hoped to be wrong. She had watched her son grow distant, cruel, distracted, but still clung to the idea that it was temporary. That he'd come back to his senses. But then came the late-night phone calls, the business trips that didn't make sense, the sudden expenses. So she did what no mother ever wants to do, she followed her own son's trail. And what she found crushed her more than any illness ever could. She described the pain of holding the photos in her hands, the humiliation of reading the messages he sent to that woman. "It wasn't just cheating," she wrote. "It was replacing you before he ever said goodbye." Her health had already been deteriorating, but this broke something deeper, her spirit. She stopped eating. She stopped smiling. But every time I visited her, she put on a brave face, not because she wasn't hurting, but because she didn't want me to carry her sadness too. And still, behind her tired eyes, she was planning how to make things right. She thanked the investigator for being discreet and thorough. She wrote about watching me bring her soup while knowing the truth and hating that she couldn't say anything yet. I needed time, she explained. Time to accept that the son I raised had become a stranger. And that you were the only real family I had left. My hand shook as I read those lines. The tears rolled freely now. Her pain had been deep, but she used it not to destroy, only to protect. That letter wasn't just a confession. It was a torch, passed into my hands. She wrote that the hardest part wasn't discovering the affair, it was the moment she stood face to face with her son, looking for a flicker of truth. She gave him one last chance. One last moment to be honest, to confess, to ask for forgiveness. But he didn't. He looked her in the eyes and lied, bold and shameless, as if she were a stranger. There's no other woman, he said. There's no child. And she knew, in that instant, that the boy she raised no longer existed. That lie was the final crack in her heart. She told me she cried alone for hours afterward. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the coldness. He didn't just cheat, she wrote. He erased everything I taught him about loyalty, about family, about respect. The cancer was killing her slowly, but that lie, that was the blade that cut straight through. From that moment, she made her decision. If he could lie to her without flinching, he didn't deserve anything she had built. I couldn't take the pain with me, she said. So I passed it to the only person I trusted to carry it with strength, you. I sat on the edge of the bed, that letter trembling in my hands like a living thing. The words were heavier than gold, deeper than any wound he'd left in me. I realized then that I hadn't just been betrayed by a husband, I had been abandoned by a family I once believed was mine. But she had seen it. She had refused to let me walk away with nothing. That night, as I folded the letter and placed it against my heart, I whispered her name through tears. Because in the end, she hadn't just left me the truth. She had left me justice. Those words stayed with me longer than anything else in that letter. You gave me dignity, I read them again and again, as if her voice was speaking directly to my soul. She had seen me when I thought no one did. She had felt my silence, my heartbreak, and still called me worthy of love. In a world that had turned its back on me, she left me a final message of belief. I wasn't just the abandoned wife anymore. I was the woman she trusted with her legacy. And that gave me a strength I didn't know I had. She ended the letter with a single sentence underlined in pen, never look back. At first, it felt impossible. How could I not look back? My whole life was there, the pain, the love, the betrayal. But then I realized, looking back had kept me trapped. It had kept me small. It had kept me married to a lie. Her final gift wasn't just financial, it was the permission to move forward. To stop waiting for apologies. To stop needing validation from those who had already shown me who they truly were. That night, I stood in front of the mirror with the letter in one hand and my wedding ring in the other. The ring that once meant forever now looked like a chain around my finger. I took a deep breath, slid it off slowly, and placed it inside her jewelry box, the one she had told me to keep. My reflection looked the same, but inside, something had shifted. I was no longer the woman begging to be chosen. I had been chosen. And from that moment on, I vowed to walk in the strength she left behind, one step at a time. I didn't cry when I closed the door to that chapter, I exhaled. For the first time in years, the silence in my home wasn't filled with fear or sadness. It was peaceful. I walked through each room, not as someone abandoned, but as someone finally set free. The walls no longer reminded me of betrayal, they waited for new stories. I lit a candle in her memory, placed her letter in a small wooden box, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. Not to grieve. To breathe. To begin again, on my own terms. The next morning, I made a list. Not of chores, but of dreams I had buried over the years, things I thought I'd never get to do because my life had become a cage. I wanted to travel. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to create something with my own hands, something that was mine and no one else's. I didn't know where to start, but for once, I wasn't afraid of not knowing. I had been stripped down to nothing. And from that nothing, I would rise, not fast, not loud, but with quiet certainty. That ring had weighed me down long enough. That house, once filled with cold stares and broken promises, was mine now, and I would fill it with warmth again. Maybe not right away, but slowly. Room by room. Memory by memory. I wouldn't rush healing. I would feel every step. But I knew one thing for sure, I would never beg for love again. I had finally remembered who I was before all the pain, and I promised myself I'd never forget her again. It was almost midnight when I heard the banging on the front door. I froze for a second, heart racing, then looked through the peephole. There he was, the man who once swore to protect me, now slurring my name with eyes red from alcohol and anger. I didn't open the door. He yelled louder, demanding I let him in, telling me everything had been a mistake. "We can fix this," he cried. "This was never supposed to happen." But his voice cracked, and that's when the truth leaked through his rage. He wasn't sorry for the betrayal. He was sorry he lost control. When I didn't respond, his tone shifted. He threatened to take back what he'd lost. Said the will meant nothing. Claimed he'd ruin my name, turn everyone against me. But his words were hollow, loud, but empty. I stood behind the locked door, calm, strong, unmoved. I wasn't the same woman who once cried quietly in the bathroom after he came home late. I wasn't the wife who begged him to love her back. I was the woman who outlived his lies, who held the proof in her hands, and didn't need his validation anymore. Finally, his threats broke into sobs. He sank to the ground on my front porch like a defeated man. "I miss you," he whispered, voice barely audible. But it was too late. I watched him from the window, tears running down his face, and felt nothing. Not hate. Not pity. Just peace. I didn't open the door. I turned off the porch light. And I walked away, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I had already chosen myself. And that choice wasn't something I would ever undo again. My hands didn't shake when I picked up the phone. I spoke clearly, calmly, as if I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my head. Within minutes, 2 officers arrived. They found him slumped on the porch, reeking of alcohol and slurred apologies. He tried to argue with them, tried to twist the story, but the officer simply said, "Ma'am, do you want to press charges?" I didn't hesitate. "I want him gone," I answered. They escorted him away without struggle. No yelling. No drama. Just quiet finality. The next day, I filed for a restraining order. The court granted it immediately, given the circumstances and the history. As I signed the documents, I felt no guilt, only clarity. That piece of paper wasn't just legal protection. It was a line in the sand. The final boundary he would never cross again. The man who once shared my bed, my table, and my life was now legally forbidden from coming near me. It was over, not just in words, but in law, in reality, in spirit. My marriage didn't end with a divorce. It ended with truth. Back at home, I stood by the door where it all happened. I looked at the scratches on the wood, the memory still fresh. And I whispered, "Never again." Not to him, to myself. I promised that this house would no longer be a place where pain entered without consequence. I was no longer a woman he could intimidate. I had survived too much to shrink back now. From that moment on, every inch of my home, every breath I took, would belong to a woman who knew her worth. And who would never let it be taken from her again. The idea came to me in the quiet of an early morning, while sipping tea by the same window where I had once cried myself to sleep. I thought about all the women like me, silenced, dismissed, betrayed, and left to rebuild alone. I wanted to give them what I never had when I needed it most: a voice, a place, a lifeline. I used part of the inheritance not to forget the past, but to transform it into hope. I named it the Teresa Foundation, after the woman who had believed in me when no one else did. I knew she would have been proud. This was her legacy: living, breathing, helping. The first women who came through the doors were hesitant, their eyes filled with the same fear I once carried. I greeted each one personally, listened to their stories without judgment. Some had been kicked out by their families. Others had fled abusive marriages. All of them thought they were alone, until they weren't. We gave them shelter, legal guidance, therapy, a chance to start over. Every hug, every tear wiped, every whispered thank you reminded me why I had survived everything. Not just to stand, but to lift others with me. And as the foundation grew, so did I. I spoke at conferences, partnered with organizations, shared my story not to relive it, but to remind others they could write their own ending too. I wasn't just the woman who had lost everything. I was the woman who built something from the ruins. Teresa gave me the match. I lit the fire. And together, through memory and mission, we changed lives. One woman at a time. It started with a small local article, just a few paragraphs about the launch of the foundation. But then a journalist called, asking for an interview. I hesitated at first. I had lived too long in silence to feel comfortable with a microphone in my face. But something in me said, it's time. So I told my story, not the scandal, but the strength. Not the betrayal, but the rebuilding. The headline read, "From Heartbreak to Hope, One Woman's Fight to Uplift Others." And just like that, the world began to listen. TV stations followed. Radio segments. Blog posts. Invitations to speak. I became, without planning it, a voice for women who had been left behind and refused to stay there. Some people still whispered cruel things behind my back. But I no longer cared. Their voices no longer held power over me. What mattered now were the women who walked through the foundation's doors, broken like I had been, and found light waiting for them. Every time I shared my story, I gave them permission to share theirs too. And in that connection, we healed, together. The first time I saw my name in a headline, I expected to feel shame. But I didn't. I felt seen. I felt free. I stood in front of a mirror, held the article in my hand, and smiled, a real smile, not one forced to survive appearances. I had made it through the storm. I had kept my soul intact. And now, I was no longer a victim. I was a woman with purpose, with clarity, and with a voice. And I vowed never to let that voice be silenced again. After the court ruling and the media attention, his world fell apart. Former colleagues cut ties. Business opportunities dried up. People who once praised him now crossed the street to avoid him. The mask he wore for so long finally cracked, and what remained underneath was a man stripped of everything he thought he deserved. The mistress stayed for a while, hoping the money would return. But when it didn't, she packed her things and left quietly in the middle of the night, taking the child with her. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just silence. I heard through someone that she moved back to her hometown, far away, where no one knew her name. She was left to raise the baby alone, a child born from deception but innocent in every way. Sometimes I wondered if he would grow up to ask questions about what happened. If he'd ever learn the truth about how his father tried to erase one woman while building a lie with another. But I also knew it wasn't my burden to carry. I had no hatred for the child. Only for the choices that brought him into a world built on betrayal. As for my ex-husband, no one really knew where he ended up. Rumors said he moved abroad, trying to escape the shadows he created. Others said he checked into rehab. I never searched for the truth. I didn't need to. His story was no longer tied to mine. Whatever he became, wherever he went, it wasn't my concern anymore. The chapter had closed. His fall didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me closure. Because in the end, I didn't need revenge. I had already won, by choosing peace over bitterness, and healing over hate. I no longer needed to explain my story to anyone. My past didn't define me, it empowered me. Every scar I carried became a reminder of what I overcame. There are still days when the silence feels heavy, when I catch my breath remembering how close I came to losing myself. But those moments don't haunt me anymore, they ground me. I walk through my home, through my city, through my life with my head held high. Not because I never fell, but because I rose on my own terms. Sometimes I visit the garden behind the foundation, where a bench holds her name engraved in bronze, in honor of Teresa, a woman who saw everything and chose love anyway. I sit there with a book or a cup of coffee and just breathe. It's where I go when I need to remember who I was and who I became. The wind feels different there, calmer, cleaner. I imagine her sitting beside me, smiling quietly, watching her legacy grow. I no longer need her voice to guide me. Her strength now lives in mine. My story didn't end with betrayal. It began with survival. I wasn't the abandoned wife, the broken woman, or the bitter soul the world expected. I was the phoenix. The fire didn't consume me, it purified me. And now, with every step forward, I honor what I lost by embracing what I built. Alone? Maybe. But never empty. Because the woman I am now isn't searching for happiness. She's creating it. One breath, one step, one brave new day at a time. I used to think closure came from answers, from justice, from seeing those who hurt you fall. But real closure? It comes in silence. In mornings where the only sound is your own breath, steady and alive. In making your bed, drinking your coffee, and not thinking about them. Healing isn't loud, it's quiet, slow, and deeply personal. And I've learned to respect that pace. Some nights I still cry. Not because I want him back, but because I mourn the version of me that loved so purely. She was naive, yes, but also brave. She believed in promises, in forever, in goodness. I cry for her, not because she failed, but because she gave everything. And in doing so, she taught me how to start again. I carry her with pride. People whispered about me at first. They said I was cold, heartless for cutting him out so quickly. But what they didn't see were the nights I didn't sleep, the meals I skipped, the tears that dried on my pillow. Strength looks like silence to those who don't understand pain. I don't owe anyone an explanation for how I survived. I just owe myself peace. The house feels different now. No more shadows in the corners, no more ghosts in the hallway. I've painted the walls, moved the furniture, and filled the rooms with laughter, mine. It's strange how a place that once held so much sorrow can be reborn with light. But that's what I've done, I've reclaimed every inch of my life, brick by brick. The baby. I think about him more than I care to admit. He didn't choose any of this. He didn't ask to be born into betrayal. One day, if fate ever allows, maybe I'll meet him. Not as the woman his father hurt, but as someone who understands what it means to grow from pain. I hope he becomes better than the man who made him. I've started traveling. I visit cities I once only dreamed about. I sit at cafes alone, write in journals, take photos of sunsets. I speak to strangers, I laugh loudly, and I wear red lipstick without apology. I am not the woman who waited anymore. I am the woman who walks toward life, unafraid and unapologetic. The foundation in my mother-in-law's name has grown. Women write to me every week, thanking me, sharing their pain, their strength, their victories. I don't have all the answers. But I offer them what Elena once gave me, a chance. A reminder that even the broken can rebuild. Even the forgotten can rise. Sometimes, late at night, I light a candle for her. I thank her. Not just for what she left me, but for what she saw in me. She believed I was more than a wife, more than a victim, more than a name on a will. She saw my fire, even when I didn't. And that changed everything. So this is where my story settles, not with revenge, not with pain, but with grace. I loved. I lost. I rose. And now, I live. Not waiting for someone to choose me, not begging for closure. I am my own beginning, my own middle, my own ending. And above all, I am free.